Good morning. I'm glad you can take some time to devote to worship. And as we turn to 1 Corinthians 5, I invite you to imagine with me that you are walking out of a store. And as you walk out the store, you're walking up on someone and you see them eating a candy bar, and they take the wrapper and they drop the wrapper on the ground. How do you respond? Now, if you don't know the person, how do you respond? Does it change if you know them? Does it change if you know them and you know them from an activity you have shared together? Let's say that you've been in Boy Scouts with them. Let's say that it's another Eagle Scout. And if that sounds oddly specific, yes, this is something that happened to me, right? And looking back on it, like I was pondering this, because I know what I did. In the moment, I looked at the person who was another Eagle Scout in the scout troop I was in, and I said to them, "Hey, dude, you're an Eagle Scout. Pick up your wrapper. We don't litter. You know better, right?" But as I looked back on it, if it hadn't been another Eagle Scout in the troop I was in, if it had been someone I just kind of knew or someone I didn't know, I wouldn't have handled it in the same way. I would have reached over and picked up the candy bar wrapper, and I would have thrown it away myself and probably muttered on my way to the car about people these days and cleaning up after themselves. Right? Paul is talking about the challenge of this type of situation in a far more serious permutation of it, but that's what Paul is talking about today in 1 Corinthians 5. That's how he gets into it. He's talking about, when do you speak up? And when do you speak up when someone in your community, someone that you know has made a commitment to a common set of values, like an Eagle Scout has made a commitment to a common set of values, right? And when do you speak up when someone who has made a commitment to a common set of values is not living up to that commitment? So what is it that needs to be spoken up about? Well, the first verse of this chapter is striking, but it lays it out, right? It says, Paul writes, "I have received a report of scandalous sex within your church family, a kind that wouldn't be tolerated even outside the church. One of your men is sleeping with his stepmother." Ugh. I know that's right. This is bad, right? This is just not a great situation. As best as we can tell, studying the text, studying the church, knowing what we know, someone of a higher social standing. This is a church that has a mix of people lower to higher social standing, people who had wealth, people who didn't have wealth, just a lot of different type of people in this church. And so as far as we can tell from the cues in this text and the rest of the books, someone of a higher social standing is sleeping with their father's second or third, we don't know, wife. Their stepmom. Now, the stepmom is probably not part of the church, because if they had been part of the church, Paul would have talked to them too, because Paul is nothing, he's not a wilting wallflower of a person. He's addressing this head on. Like he would have said something if it was a person in the church. So we're going to assume it's not someone in the church. And we're going to, based upon our knowledge of the time, we know that childbirth was far more dangerous, and that would have been very unfortunately common for a woman to die in childbirth. And if a fellow of higher social standing has some wealth accrued, if his wife dies and he has children, he would remarry, and if he remarries a significantly younger woman, and then his eldest son and his second or third wife might be of a similar-ish age. And so what we don't know, like, is the father still alive? Is this incest, adultery? Like, what flavor of crazy and ugly is this? We don't know a lot. But we do know that it's bad. It's just not a good situation, right? And the people in the church know that this is happening. Paul has found out about it from a long distance away. He has been told about it, and so he's writing back to the church, and this letter is going to be read in to the church. So everyone in the church, like this kind of like the shared thing, people know that this is happening. What we do know is that Paul, as he writes them, is he states an interesting thing that is really we got to stop and grapple with for a second. He writes them and he says, even the Gentiles don't do this. And you look at this church. This is a church that was built on Gentiles, because a Gentile in the Jewish line of thought is anyone who is not a Jew. Right? And then Paul goes through and he lists all the things that the Torah, the teaching to the Jewish people, forbids and tells them not to do. So when Paul is writing to this church of people who were not raised as Jews, when he's telling them that even the Gentiles, the non-Jews, don't do this, the implied thing there, the implied understanding is that Paul is seeing these people as following in the footsteps of the Jewish people. And thus, they should turn to the Old Testament, turn to the Jewish Torah, the Jewish teachings, and be guided by them. And so not worship other gods or bear false witness or commit adultery or give in to greed or do any of the things that the Torah teaches them not to do. That's what the list Paul will give later of what not to do. And it's a list that comes out of Deuteronomy, right? And he also does something interesting with this, in that when he talks about these things that Torah teaches them not to do, he lists them, but he changes how they are applied. Because he doesn't say that we should stone them, because the consequences for the things that Paul is going to list in a little bit is stoning, right? As in like the death penalty. And what Paul is going to say is, as people who don't do these things, if you do them, you are cast out, you are cast away from the source of life, following Jesus in the church. You are cast out onto a path that leads to death. But he doesn't actually say that we should stone them. And so it's this interesting combination where he looks at these people who are not born and raised Jewish, but now having chosen to follow Jesus Christ, they are inheritors of the Jewish tradition and the Jewish teaching, and they're committing to follow the Jewish Torah, but he's not saying we have to follow it in this literalistic fashion. He is doing what Jews to this day do. They read the Torah and they discern how to apply it for today. And if that's how his logic works for the church at Corinth, it's the same logic for the church at Monroe City and Shelbina. These are churches full of people. We weren't born Jewish, but as people who have chosen to follow Jesus, we are, as the church at Corinth was, full of people who are committing to look at the Old Testament and to be guided by it, but not to be guided by it in a literalistic fashion such that we're going to start stoning people. Because like the literalistic reading of if a child is not going to obey his or her parents, the Torah tells you to take them out back and stone them. And I'm not going to stone my children if they don't obey me again and again and again. There will be consequences. But we apply that it's important to obey your parents without enforcing it in quite this how it was done then. And so just the way that Paul starts talking about this makes it clear that it's something I hear on occasion, like this idea that like we follow Jesus and so we can just like write off the Old Testament. We don't need to pay attention to it. It doesn't apply to us. No. Jesus came to fulfill the Old Testament. And that was what we see how Paul is talking through this with the church at Corinth. We're going to talk about some of the requirements of the Old Testament with Torah, the teaching for the Jewish people, and how do they apply to you here in the church. Okay. So, I've dodged as long as I can. Like, what is the actual precipitating factor here? What is bringing about this discussion? Well, they have this issue with sexuality, right? In the Jewish culture, in the Christian culture that developed, fidelity and monogamy is the given, like that is what we hold up as the way people are meant to practice being together, right? That's how we're supposed to live. Fidelity and monogamy. That's how marriage is supposed to happen. And to become a follower of Jesus was to commit to that Jewish and then Christian practice and understanding. And it was not the understanding of the time in the Greco-Roman culture. To say that we're called to live lives of fidelity and monogamy, now it just doesn't sound like a big deal. Back then, it was. And so this is like to make a commitment to follow Jesus, this is one of the ways you tell whether someone is following through with their commitment. Are they committing to this particular aspect of the Jewish tradition? Now that we set up, like, why is this dealt with first? Because this is one of the first ways that we're talking about the way we see whether people of this generation have committed to following Jesus and taking it seriously. We need to notice that while Paul starts by talking about an individual person and an individual activity, after the first verse, the pronouns shift from second person individual, second person singular, you, like this one person doing this, they change to being second person plural. And it's one of those things that is just unfortunate about the English language, that we don't say y'all enough. We just need to say y'all more often. I can't quite get my tongue around you'ns, but the second person plural matters. And it's in this passage. This passage is full of second person plural. Paul is talking to y'all, the church, as he writes this, right? And so to read this, I'm going to read out of the Message with the second person plural. Here's what Paul puts it, right? Paul says, and y'all are so above it all that doesn't even faze y'all what's happening here. Shouldn't this break your heart? Shouldn't it bring y'all to your knees in tears? Shouldn't this person and his conduct be confronted and dealt with? Right? This is he's making this comment to the entire church, right? Paul continues, I'm going to tell y'all what I'm going to do. Y'all want him, and he talks about that. We'll get to that detail in a moment. But later in the passage, he says, like, y'all want this person to be on his feet before the master and not to be judged wanting, right? Y'all's flip and callous arrogance in these things bothers me, bothers Paul. Y'all pass it off as a small thing, but it's anything but that. Right? So Paul is continuing his focus up to this point in the letter. Paul has been focused on factions and how y'all, the church at Corinth, how the whole church has been dividing into factions. I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, I follow Christ. Like, people have been dividing into factions, and Paul doesn't suddenly just like home in on one person and say, now I'm going to focus on one person. He keeps on talking about how this one person's actions has implications for y'all as a church, because y'all have been taking sides about whether to condone this person's actions, and y'all have a problem about this. Right? And so what has happened, Paul has learned about this situation and has learned how it's been wrapped up in the factions of the church. And what happens when people were divided into teams, us and them, the temptation is to say, we support our side, right or wrong. And that he is, or if like he is one of them, of course one of them would do something like that, or he's one of us, well, we'll just let it slide because he's one of us. We don't want to go too hard on him, right? And Paul is writing to them and saying, no, this is not about one group or another in the church. This is not about us and them. There's no factions involved in this. It's the church. And y'all need to be able to say that this is a problem. Y'all have a shared commitment to following Jesus, and this isn't what it looks like for this person to be doing this. So what Paul tells them is that as you read this letter, something's going to happen. And in the same way that, like, when a judge declares you guilty, that's it. That's when now you have been declared guilty. Or when a husband, when is a couple actually married? When they're standing in front of the altar, when the pastor says, I now declare you, bam, that's when it happens. You are husband and wife, right? And so Paul is using that type of logic. As you're reading this letter, I am with you. And as you read this, what's happening is I am casting this person out from y'all, right? This person is being cast out from the church. The reading of the letter in the church worship service makes, as Paul's words are read to the people, Paul's words take effect, and this person has been cast out. And the literal translation of the actual words Paul says is, I hand him over to the Satan. Woo, that's heavy, isn't it? Right? So Paul has written, like, as you read this letter, as soon as you hear these words, this guy is handed over to the Satan. And Paul is following the Jewish tradition of the Satan, as in it's a job title or a description, right? It's like the teacher, the pastor, or the judge, or the police officer. It's the Satan. It's the job of someone who accuses. And in this case, it's accusing someone of having broken the Torah, and the accusation is accurate. They have committed some sort of adulterous type of thing that we don't fully understand, and frankly, I don't want to. But Paul is saying, this person has been removed from the church, the source of life, following Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life, right? And has been cast out to the Satan who accuses them of wrongdoing, and is leading, and they're chosen that in their actions. They've chosen that, and they're walking away from life. And the term Paul uses is they have embraced sarx, the flesh. They have decided to embrace the ways of the flesh instead of the ways of the Spirit and truth that Jesus invites us to do. And so, to hand someone over to the Satan, it's not to say that we want them to be gone forever. Paul writes about in 2 Corinthians, the next letter to the church that has these issues, right? 2 Corinthians 2, Paul writes, about a certain individual, which may be this, maybe another, someone else, we don't know, but writes and tells the church, like, be sure to bring that person back in if they're ready to come in, right? If they do not let them linger away from the church too long so that they might not be overwhelmed, is how Paul puts it, right? And so to be cast out, handed over to the Satan, is not meant to be something that is a permanent situation. It's meant to get them to understand the problem so that they will then turn and say, but I do want to follow Jesus and return to the way, the truth, and the life. Right? So Paul needs to help them, help them, the church, understand that even when you're tempted to kind of downplay this, like, it's just what they're doing at home. Like, that's in the privacy of their own room, whatever. That's just between, whatever they do is fine, right? Paul has to punch through that and help them understand that this is a problem, right? Because this probably, it comes off as really dramatic today. It wasn't any less dramatic back then. And so he compares it to leaven. And the way that when you leaven the loaf, like, so when you make bread every week, you take a piece of the dough from last week and you add it to the dough for this week, right? And you bake. And so every week you take a piece of the unused dough, and you add it to the dough for next week, and that way that causes the bread to rise. And if you do that again and again and again, and you never stop and sort of restart the process, your leaven can go bad. And then you bake the bread, and it is nasty. Ugh, right? Bad bread. Ugh. And so there's a process every year in the Jewish tradition, the Paschal feast, the Passover, right? And so that is when you get all the leaven out of the house and you start fresh. It's the feast of unleavened bread, the bread that isn't rise, because the bread of being eaten in a hurry because you're leaving to get out of Egypt. It's also the time you just get rid of all of it, because bad leaven can spoil a whole lot of bread, and you got to start from scratch and get it right. And Paul points to what we're turning to is Jesus, following Jesus. That's what is the leaven that needs to leaven our lives and transform our lives and cause us all to grow into who we're called to be. And so Paul is connecting this, like cleaning out the things that will just mess up our lives. And he says, instead, we celebrate this festival not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. We're being honest and sincere with each other about what it means, how we're called to follow Jesus and live by the guidance of the Torah, right? Now, we don't bake anywhere near as much today as people did then, so I don't think we have quite the same experience and understanding of how when leaven goes bad, it can make life really hard. The best comparison I would draw today would be something like our bodies are meant to grow and cells replicate and we heal, and that's a good thing, but when that growth goes badly, unhealthy growth, we have a word for that, it's cancer. And when cancer spreads, it spoils and damages and destroys things, right? Yeah, and so that's kind of it's the same logic, it's the same type of explanation. Like something, if you let this one thing go bad, it will spread and cause many more problems. An untreated cancer, if you let it be untreated, it will spread and cause many, many more problems. Okay, so Paul has laid out his argument, right? This is a problem. Y'all have to handle it. Y'all can't jump into sides that he's on our side, so we're going to not go easy on him, or he's one of them, so we'd expect that of them. We can't do that. And that, I'm just telling you, we're going to cast him out right now, because if we don't do it, he's not going to realize it's a problem. He's not going to have this opportunity to repent and turn and get his life back straight. And if we don't do it now, it's only going to get worse, and it's going to cause more problems. Paul's laid out his argument, and he has this moment, that all of the type of moment we all have at times, when we're making this argument and we can feel what the person is going to say. You ever say that you're laying out this argument, and as soon as you get done, you can hear it, that they're going to come back with, but what about? And so Paul just heads them off. He says, I know. Right? I can feel that you're going to say he rushes to say, I know. I'm telling you to walk away from people who are wrapped up in their sin and are not repenting and will not see this is the case unless something dramatic happens. And I, Paul, am not saying that this applies to everyone. I'm not saying that we should walk away from everyone in the world because the world is full of people who are not perfect, right? I'm not saying that. What I, Paul, am saying is that if someone calls themselves a follower of Jesus, a brother or sister in this family that we call church, and if someone who is part of the church is his exact words, sexually immoral or greedy or an idolater, or reviler, a drunkard, or a robber, then these are the people we don't eat with, right? If someone in the church is lapsing deep into a really catastrophic form of sin, sexual immorality, greed, idolater, reviler, drunkard, robber, right? Then we as people who are also in the church do not eat with them. Hand them over to the Satan, because this is a problem that will spread. But we are not the people, Paul continues, to judge those outside the church. That's not what we're talking about here. I, Paul, am talking to you, y'all, the church, about what's happening in the church. People outside the church, I'm not judging them because they haven't made a commitment to follow this way of life. They haven't committed to following Jesus, so I'm not going to hold them to a commitment that they haven't made, right? This is about what we expect of each other. And we expect of each other that we have committed to following Jesus, which means we are fulfilling what the Torah teaches. How we live that today, that is our gig, that's what we're talking about. Excuse me. So, that is Paul's very serious 5th chapter of the first letter to the church at Corinth. And the question for us today is, how do we take this seriously? How do we use this, right? Yes, we endeavor not to fall into the particular situation that brings us about, we are committed to monogamy and fidelity, that's important, right? Support our marriages, that's a good thing. But that doesn't really seem to get at the meat of what Paul is concerned about. Right? He's concerned about one particular person, but he's also far more concerned about y'all, about the community of the church. And so, how do we live as a community that is called to follow Jesus, who is perfect, as people who are not perfect? How do we do this as people who are raised to focus on my business is my business, not to get involved in other people's business? Right? How do we do this as people who are raised with privacy as an essential value, and in a time when unsolicited suggestions or feedback is often received as the other person being a jerk? If someone gives me unsolicited or unasked for feedback, like what's the likelihood I'm going to take that as a gift? Not often. Right? What expectations do we have of each other, and how do we hold each other to those expectations? And how do we do it in a way that doesn't lead to factions and splitting of the church? I wish I could give you the simple answer to this question, or this set of questions, this set of Paul's concerns. I don't think there is a simple answer. But what I can do is I can tell you what I do, and I can invite you to consider it for yourself. My commitment is to follow Jesus, and to take this commitment to follow Jesus, to take it seriously. I think that is the simplest, most direct way to state what it is that we can expect of each other, too. I hope that it is your commitment, that as part of the church, that you're going to take following Jesus seriously. Okay. And I will further say that if you're listening to this, watching, reading, however you're engaging this, if you have a concern about my following Jesus, how I'm doing that, I would like to know. Let me suggest that when you do that, the best way to start such discussions is to say, Andy, I have a concern about, and then tell me. I don't beat around the bush, just I'm concerned about this, right? And having told you what I do, right? I'm inviting you. This is a non-rhetorical invitation, right? I'm telling you, this is my invitation to people who are part of the church with me. I invite you to tell me when you have a concern about how I'm following Jesus, if I'm doing it, taking that seriously, right? I invite you to do the same. And I invite you to specifically to explicitly authorize multiple people to do this. Tell them, people who are in this church, who are part of the church, if you have a concern, please tell me. Because we all know that we don't speak up unless we are authorized to do so. Like in the sermon, I preach a sermon every week, and y'all keep on coming back. It's crazy, right? But like that, you have, by showing up, you have authorized me to say something about our life together. Like, that's kind of an implicit authorization. But when it comes to this type of thing, where we're talking about, like, how are we each acting individually, we have to explicitly authorize people, or else we're just not going to say anything, right? So please, explicitly authorize people to tell you when they have a concern. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of the saints of the church, he was a German theologian in the early 20th century. Right? He writes a book called Life Together, and he writes about the challenges and the joys of living together as Christians. And what he says about this very challenge is, nothing can be more cruel than kindness that leaves another in sin. And nothing can be more compassionate than the severe rebuke that calls a brother or a sister back from the path of sin. I would rather we learn to do this with it being a concern raised before it has to become a rebuke, or much less a severe rebuke. But I believe that is our calling as the church, to have a common expectation of each other, that we are taking following Jesus seriously in our lives. And that because we're doing that, that we will not ignore the sin in each other, but instead be willing to invite, authorize, and then be willing to bring up the failings that lead us away from Jesus, so that this might be a place where our lives are transformed by the grace of God to be more Christ-like this day and each day. Amen.